So let's get to the point. Do you even need a primer when you're just going to paint over it? Well, luckily for you, I'm a figure it out as I go kind of guy and only check instructions once something's on fire, meaning yes, you really do need to use primer as my failure clips will show. Why? 3 reasons. First, a lot of paints won't stick to plastic. Some will just slide off like water and others may stick initially, but will fail the Scotch tape test, which is taking a piece of Scotch tape, putting it over the paint, and then pulling it away to see if any paint comes off. If any does, it means the paint isn't sticking properly to the model, in which case it's very likely cracks will eventually form in the paint and begin flaking off. Primer is meant to stick to plastic and other surfaces though, and then for all kinds of paint to stick to it, ensuring you'll not only get a smoother paint job, but one that should last you years or decades. This brings us to Number 2, lots of paints contain chemicals damaging to plastics and other materials, the worst offenders being lacquers, enamels, and a lot of your specialty and metallic paints. I've had a couple of times I didn't use a primer with these paints, and then had issues with several plastic pieces breaking on me with barely a touch. Now it is true if you use something like a water-based acrylic paint, you're very unlikely to damage anything. However, I would still advise you use a primer due to point number 3. Primers affect the color quality and tint of the paint put over it. Additionally, many model paints are made specifically to be used over a primer, and the paint won't come out correctly when primer isn't used. Due to most model paints either being very thin and/or water-based, they are semi-transparent even when it isn't perceptibly noticeable. This means the primer will show through just enough to affect things like the color shade and vibrancy. When using the correct primer, everything appears noticeably better. Think of it like going from an old standard definition TV to a cutting-edge high definition TV. The visuals are very noticeably better. So what color primer do I use for what color? What effects do the different primary colors have? Well, I've got my example spoons out to go over just that. Now there are some different primer colors from what I have here, but even most experts, including myself, don't use anything other than the 5 I have laid out here. So we'll just go over these. First is gloss black primer. You'll use this with all your metallic paints. It doesn't matter if you want to do a whitish silver, you're still going to want to go with a gloss black primer. The reason being the black will give it a more solid feel, and the reflective gloss will help with giving it that semi-reflective metallic look. It's also important you use gloss black and not just regular black too. If you use regular black, you run the risk of losing that metallic look and having your silver come out looking more like a gray. All that being said, it would be negligent not to mention that a small minority of people feel a gray does sometimes work better for certain metallic colors like silver. In my personal opinion, they're wrong, and I would just stick with gloss black for all metallics. If you're the type who like to experiment though, feel free to play around with both and let me know what you think in the comments. And that does bring us to our second color, gray. If you can only afford 2 primers, I would go with gloss, black, and gray. Gray is basically your default primer color. I like to think of gray as the C student of primers. He's good enough to pass with just about any color, but he's never the best, even with other gray paints. Now, while this is true for movable models, I have heard this is not the case when it comes to things like gaming figurines or anime statues. I've been told by people who do very advanced, detailed painting of these that gray is best in many cases because, being neutral, it has the best balance between any highlighting and shadowing they add. I've never painted any figurines or done any highlighting or shadowing, however, so I can't say either way. Next, I'm going to do white and black together as they work the same way, just with opposite results. So any bright colors, fluorescents, anything with a lighter shade, you'll use white, and anything that's darker, you'll use black. For something more in between or neutral, you can really use either. In those cases, if you use white, it'll come out lighter, and if you use black, it'll come out darker. Be careful with black, though. If the paint is too thin or the color isn't that dark, sometimes the black will show through too strongly, like in the case of this red I used here. On the other side, if you use a really dark color over white, it can lighten it so much the color basically changes like from black to gray. This is less of an issue if you use spray cans or brushes, as the paint is thicker than when using an airbrush. That being said, if this happens with an airbrush, wait for the first coat to dry, and then go back and add another layer. With multiple layers, you can sometimes get the color to come back depending on the color, paint, and so forth. Finally, we have pink. Probably the color I use the least. I really only ever use pink with red and occasionally with orange or yellow. I don't know enough color theory to explain why, but a pink primer just adds a warmth to red that makes it look much more dynamic. Now that's everything you need to know about primers. A few last minute tips though. For painting models, I would advise getting a model primer. For spray paints, Tamiya and Mr. Hobby are both affordable and work well. And for airbrushes, you can do Vallejo or Green World stuff, as neither requires thinning and can go straight into the airbrush. For the spoons here, I did all Green World stuff primers except for pink, which is Mr. Hobby 1500. Why the 1500? Well, some primer brands like to offer different quality primers, usually somewhere in the range between 500 and 2000. Now, the higher the number, the smoother the surface. I wouldn't really worry too much about that, though. You should be fine with anything 1000 or higher. The only primers I would advise staying away from are Army Painter and non-model primers, both for the same reason. The paint is a bit too thick for models, which can cause various issues, and both have 1 to 2 day dry times, which can end up slowing you down. Finally, if money is no object, the very best primers are Alclad Lacquer primers. I've gotten their black primer and gloss black primer. I will likely only get gloss black primer from them in the future, though. This is because I can see a bit of an improvement with the gloss black when it comes to metallic colors and Alclad chrome. But when it comes to standard colors, I'm just not seeing a difference between it and your typical primer. And that's everything I have on primers. Now, if you would like a particular paint or model product reviewed, please let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Also, if you would, please consider donating through my Patreon or buy me a coffee. The links will be in the description. The more money I get, the more reviews and videos I can make. Thank you for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.